Hello, everyone. So when I took a look at the Global Affairs Canada website, it described the Canadian relationship with the U.S. as a unique relationship. When you go to the Department of State, it describes that relationship as one of the closest and most extensive anywhere in the world. USMCA got more votes in Congress than any other free trade agreement in all of American history. We've just learned that the U.S. and Canada will be going to the moon and back. And a recent Gallup survey of Americans has an 88% favorability rating for Canada. So I actually look at it differently than we just heard. 88%, you guys had it easy. What an easy job you had. So what I'd like to do to get the conversation going is to recognize that despite that 88%, although Ambassador Jacobson said I should ask him why it wasn't 95%, but I want each of you to answer this question. As you look at the U.S.-Canada relationship, what keeps you up at night? If you had to name one thing, what keeps you up at night? John.
I think probably the capacity to get goods and services across the border, the thickening of the border, whether it's on security or any other reasons, because the whole Canadian economy and parts of the U.S. economy come to a standstill. So that would be the thing that worries me the most.
Barry? I also believe the border, having gone through 9/11.
We need some variability here, just so we're clear. We have to have some variability here.
Smart, I sat
It'll
here.
be a real fast.
No, it's always the work. You can never take it for granted. We saw there's been excellent reports written actually by the Wilson Institute about some of the retraction on our border cooperation during COVID. I think at a time like that, we needed greater border cooperation and operational effectiveness. We saw after 9/11, I remember with the Wilson Institute, the former chair of the Wilson Institute had written a report about Canada did not, the terrorists did not come from Canada. I actually carried that in a piece of paper in my pocket when I met with a senator or a congressional representative who believed or purported to believe that they may have come from Canada. We finally have an agreement, and Bruce Heyman and I were involved in that. Ambassador Heyman and I were involved in that with Jay Johnston and Napolitano before that to get an agreement that is now legislated as opposed to just administrative. But that is so vitally important, and it does keep us awake. I was in Washington when the horrible situation happened out of London to Detroit, and that, again, closed the border down even after 9/11. So it's always a work in progress.
So before I go on to Bruce, we've also seen recently President Biden obviously came to Canada, and one of the agreements that was announced was with respect to immigration. Does that change how you view these issues at all?
Well, that's been in the works for a while, and I'm glad that they came to an agreement. I think that's positive to have an agreement on immigration. I think for Canadians, it's sometimes very important for us to understand the tremendous difficulty for any U.S. administration with the southern border. And we've got it pretty good with our American neighbors on our south, and there's not too many people going from Baffin Island to Nunavut in Canada. So we have to have a lot of empathy and support for our American friends trying to manage immigration on our border, but also the crucial and politically divisive issue of immigration on the southern border.
John, same view coming out of the Biden deal?
For me on immigration, we're very blessed in this country that both the government and the opposition are generally speaking support pluralism, support large immigration levels, and I think that's a blessing. It's not a political domestic debate. I think one of the things we've got to be very careful of is to maintain strong support for immigration. There's got to be integrity to it. We had two boats from with folks from Southeast Asia, from Sri Lanka, and the huge spike in the unpleasant side of Canadians came out, and we went to extraordinary measures to ensure that those illegal immigration didn't happen, so that we can have very open and large immigration and maintain the political consensus for it. That's why I think border security is so important on immigration.
Bruce, what keeps you up at night?
Well, first of all, you assume I sleep. So, but in all seriousness, I'm going to take a little different tact on this answer, because I think that there are a lot of tactics, and when it comes to tactics, I think our ambassadors are doing an amazing job, and that was demonstrated this last week in the agreements that were reached. My family came 110 years ago from Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, Lithuania, seeking freedom, religious, economic freedom, fearing Russian persecution. They came to the United States. My wife's family came to Canada from that same region. And we came, and we've been operating for 100 years in our two countries. And I think what has made us most successful is that we've been functioning as liberal democracies. And we've been doing it at home, and we've been promoting it out in the world. Those liberal democracies, and I don't mean the Liberal Party or the Democratic Party, I mean the protections of our government, the independent judiciary, the functioning of multi-party system, at least two good, strong parties. We were chatting earlier. I grew up as a Republican. I worked on Capitol Hill. My first two inaugurations were Republican presidents. And where I find myself today is I didn't leave the Republican Party. The Republican Party left me. And I'm a moderate. And so what I worry about most for the Canada-U.S. relationship is what's happening back at home. And today is a perfect example. And look, it's a huge mistake not to put that on the table. That we have a former president, and as president, led an insurrection against the United States of America, threatening the life of the vice president. That we have a person who has now been charged with more than 30 felonies and potentially many more jurisdictions looking at it. And yet there's a division within the Republican Party right now. Those that are deeply supportive of him. He's leading in the polls in the Republican Party. He has the money. He is likely, if the vote was today, likely the nominee. And so where we stand is where a great Republican president stood, at least just before he became president in 1858, Abraham Lincoln, and talked about a house divided against itself cannot stand. And in that speech, he said, the Union won't fall, the house won't fall, but we won't remain divided. So we'll either become one thing or the other. And that's where we are in the United States of America today. We're going to become one thing or the other. And I know where I'm going to continue to work and fight. But if we become that other, that's the greatest threat to the U.S.-Canada relationship, but that's the greatest threat to our own democracy at home.
Kelly. So you obviously saw the relationship up close in two different offices. Based on either of those, what keeps you up at night?
Well, you know, from my standpoint, it's amazing what a Twitter feed will do to an ambassador's state of mind. And I'm just thankful that that gentleman did not discover TikTok while I was in Canada. But from the vantage point that I had of serving both as ambassador, first female ambassador to Canada, and then serving as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, you know, when your real estate agent says to you, location, 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 it's everything. Well, I've traveled the world, and you look at Israel, and location, location, location is everything. And we need to remember that and take advantage of the fact that North America is strong, and we are the envy. And I can tell you firsthand, we are the envy of the rest of the world. But if we are complacent, we're going to lose that North America power. So I think we all have to keep in mind that this is an agreement that has set the precedent for other agreements around the world. And at the moment, in the Security Council, the United States is not the superpower. Just look who is the president of the UN Security Council this month, Russia. Russia has now become the junior partner to China. So those are the things that keep me up at night, and how that affects our USMCA and how we cannot afford to be complacent.
Now I'm switching gears on you. So you've just told us what keeps you up at night. Reverse that. What gets you up in the morning? What is the big thing that you look forward to in terms of the potential in the U.S.-Canada relationship? I'll go down the line again. John.
I think the biggest thing I would say for the relationship, I was going to say a large mortgage gets me up every morning. The thing that would get me up every morning on the relationship would be, I think we need a lot more ambition on the relationship. I think when we've had leaders who've had ambition, we tend to do much better, and that's a bipartisan thing. In many respects, the current government did better when they had the threat of Trump abrogating the North American Free Trade Agreement. They stepped up to the plate in a big way. We're very ambitious. When President Clinton took office, he stepped up to the plate to save NAFTA. Brian Mulroney stepped up to the plate to negotiate the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement to get the acid rain deal, which took years to get, but he put his credibility on the line. He spent political capital. So I think we need governments, both in Canada and the United States, that approach the relationship with ambition.
So in some ways, and I think some of you have gotten to this, it's the notion that neither side can take the other for granted or the relationship itself for granted.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is that when I was foreign minister, you tend to deal with problems. And we don't have the same problems because, by and large, with the United States, when you look at 193 countries represented at the UN, we, by and large, generally speaking, share the same values, share the same interests. Ronald Reagan used to say within his party that if someone agreed with you 80% of the time, they were an 80% friend, not a 20% enemy. Whereas with the United States and Canada, it's probably 95%, because when we're dealing with the humanitarian crisis in Syria, we're dealing with the challenge of Russia and Ukraine, our values and interests are pretty closely aligned. So we just can't take it. We just can't take it for granted.
Gary.
Well, when I get up in the morning, I'm always in a good mood. So, especially after the first cup of coffee, getting up in the morning, working in that beautiful embassy in Washington, D.C., was always a very, very proud moment for me when I was representing Canada. I found in my work that I became very proud of the relationship with the Canadian military and the U.S. military. And we had military generals and admirals in the Canadian embassy. And they had a terrific relationship of respect and information, and it was very, very valuable. We, of course, at that time, were in Afghanistan. I remember General Petraeus, who was in general command, came up to me one day when I was in there about 1 month in Washington. He came up to me and he said, "There's a lot of countries that are going to be at this meeting you're at today, a lot of other ambassadors. I just want you to know, some of them are in the Club Med section of Afghanistan, and Canada is in the toughest, most serious fight of anywhere in that country, sacrificing a great deal with tremendous skill." And it made me very, very proud. And I would say every morning there was similar stories like that that reinforce the pride of representing my country in that wonderful city and that wonderful country.
You know, Gary, when you talk about the military relationship, the national security relationship, I think sometimes we look at our countries as being so closely aligned and sharing so many values that we fail to pause for a moment and talk about, quite frankly, the huge Canadian sacrifice, whether it be in Afghanistan or now what's taking place in Ukraine. Canada's the 5th largest contributor, I believe, military assistance to Ukraine. But sometimes I think we're so close that we simply don't pause for the moment and talk about it. So, Bruce.
Like ambassadors before me and after me, I had the distinct privilege of traveling this beautiful country, every province, every territory, cities large and small. And as I tell people, I came to Canada liking Canada, and I never really left, but I fell in love. And I came to realize the importance of the relationship at its core, but I also came to realize how we're family. And we have so many shared relationships across our border. And we have more Americans probably living in Canada than anywhere else in the world. hope they vote. And more Canadians living in the United States than almost anywhere else in the world. And yes, families, we get together at Thanksgiving, and it isn't always smooth, but we're family. And we're going to work things out, but we're very lucky and fortunate to have Canada as our next door neighbor and border, and I'm deeply privileged to have spent time visiting all of you, and I love coming back as much as I can.
Kelly.
Well, thank you. You know, as the U.S. ambassador to Canada that was here to rip up NAFTA and renegotiate for USMCA, you know, I think about as we approach our 3rd anniversary on July the 1st, have we fulfilled the promises? Because then as we approach 2025, when we're going to have, you know, really take a deep dive into USMCA, making certain, obviously I'm very partial to Kentucky, making certain, did we fulfill the promises to our auto manufacturing? Have we done that? Yes, we see that with the EV production plant in Toronto, with the one in Kentucky and Tennessee, making certain that before we get to 2025 and 2026, that we listen to Janice Stein. What does she say about AI? Are we ready for that with USMCA? You know, you see the chapters. I mean, our labor value content has been such an asset to both Canada, US, and Mexico with our auto industry. We have to make certain that before we get to that point, that we're not complacent, that we then can, you know, upgrade and meet the next couple, 10, 20 years. So that's what I think about is, you know, how are we going to make certain that being partial to the state of Kentucky is how do we fulfill the promises that we all made to every governor in every state and in all of the local mayors, all the elected officials that had something to do with you. So this was not just Washington and Ottawa. This was about state to state, province to province. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say what an incredible opportunity it was to work alongside Ambassador McNaughton, who we wish was here today.
So what I didn't hear any of you talk about, either as what keeps you up at night or what excites you as you go to work the next day, is energy. What I always find interesting, if you ask the average American, where does the U.S. get its oil from? And you start listing off the countries, Canada probably doesn't even make the top 15. And of course, it is the, in many ways, most important source. As we look at the new energy future, arguably, it can be again, that critical role because of critical minerals, so much of the discussions today. So I want each of you to talk about what you see as the possibilities for enhanced U.S.-Canada energy relationship and what might hold that back.
Well, first, I think we still need to transition to renewable fuels. We still need fossil fuels for the next 25, 35 years. We've got to be able to, the situation with Michigan is obviously a huge concern for those of us in Southern Ontario. So we hope we can deal with those challenges. I think there's good alignment on auto policy, on electric vehicles, and what it will take to get there. My big thing with critical minerals, it's not just the national security side, which I think there's pretty unanimous agreement on both sides of the border, but on this side of the border, we've got to be more ambitious. We have all these environmental rules to stop bad things from happening, but not environmental rules to facilitate good things happening. And obviously, the critical minerals panel I sat through was excellent. And obviously, there's a whole lot of permits, not just for the mining of lithium and other nickel and others, but also for processing here, so that we can onshore it and be right where the auto manufacturing assembly is in Canada and the United States. So that's a big priority. We also, frankly, need to look at the grids. We're not accomplishing nearly as much in Saskatchewan, Alberta, with more electric vehicles because there's still fossil fuel electricity generation. Here in Ontario, that's been, by and large, dealt with in a major way.
Also, infrastructure. What I always find amazing when you talk to people about critical minerals, they sometimes don't realize they actually come from the ground, and you've actually got to physically move them. Infrastructure, is that a challenge for both sides of the border, too?
Yeah, I mean, the approval, the timelines for approvals are long, and I think there's broad spread agreement we need to do more to speed it up. And maybe that involves saying no to a project in 8 months rather than in 8 years or waiting in 8 years and then having 300 requirements to follow through on, which make the project uneconomic. I think one of the things we discovered in the great economic downturn in 2009, 2010, we expedited the environmental approvals process. We did 23,000 projects across the country, and we said one project, one environmental assessment instead of two, and it was so successful we made it permanent. And one of the opposition parties got up in the House of Commons and said, this has been a disaster, now you're going to make it permanent. And I said, well, can you name me one project of the 23,000 that we did where there was a problem? And the response I got from Jack Layton, then leader of the opposition, was, well, that's not the point. The next day they found one, and it wasn't a stimulus project, it was the main infrastructure program, and it had two environmental assessments.
22,999 labs.
But it wasn't even one of the 23,000 is my point. So I think we can have tough, rigorous environmental assessment that just make them more expeditious.
Gary, you view energy future the same way?
Well, I first of all want to make an admission. My home province of Manitoba approved a critical mineral mining site, and you're right, you don't pick the apples off the trees. It is a mine, and it's owned by a state-owned enterprise from China. And I think as a former premier, I don't know how that happened and why it's not part of the existing system between our two countries and within our country. I would say if you look back, one of the areas that I'm disappointed at is the opportunities we have together working on climate and energy together. We've all won the lottery being born in Canada and the United States. We've got what the world needs and wants, and we certainly have it in our own neighborhood. And I always thought, instead of looking at this project and it becoming a nitpickers convention or that project, we should look at a comprehensive plan in our neighborhood where you would have energy security and environmental sustainability together. We can provide from Canada, obviously, renewable energy with hydropower. We're blessed with that. We work together on light vehicle emission standards, Canada and the United States together, announcing our standards that has reduced emissions in the United States more than any other measure, and in Canada. We should work together on sharing best practices on traditional energies. We should be proposing rules on methane gas, in terms of maintaining the advantage of that. And of course, we should work with traditional oil. It makes no sense at all to me, as a retired ambassador, to have oil coming from Venezuela to the United States when it can come from Canada. And it makes no sense to me at all to be under pressure from countries that don't have the best interests of North America in mind. So I think we should deal with climate change and the environment and energy security and energy reliability together. And I think we could have a more comprehensive plan rather than the media having to be just determining who's the winner and loser on said proposal. And I think we're missing it. I would also say the same thing about water, but I've already taken too much time on energy and the environment.
Bruce?
So let's just take this just a little bit different and say for national security reasons, we need energy independence. I think that's different than self-sufficiency. And what I mean by that is we have plenty of oil between our two countries to fuel our two countries. But the price of oil is dictated on world markets. So this week, the Arabs and OPEC decided to cut production, and boom, 6% increase in the price of oil. That didn't change based on how many barrels we make together or anything else. We do not control the price of our energy. So we need to have alternative energy. Yes, it's also benefit for climate, but for our national security, we need to control energy and its price and have energy that's priced locally as opposed to on the international markets, where those markets are influenced by nefarious actors who have their own interests in mind and not ours. And so I take the fossil fuel alternative energy and a little bit different approach, and I say for national security reasons, we need to accelerate that. Amazing hydro opportunities from Canada into the United States, shared construction of alternative energy and wind and solar and everything else, but we need it for national security reasons.
Kelly.
Well, I look at this a little differently. You're talking about being in our neighborhood, Gary. You know, in Kentucky, we are an abundance of coal.
Yes.
So I look at, serving under the Trump administration, we were energy independent. And I think that's very important from a national security standpoint. I think it's important that each state is different in what their natural resources are and the availability. I mean, you need to look no further than if you look at West Virginia with what just happened with Manchin, if you look at in Kentucky with our coal industry. Yes, we have to look at the future, but we also have to look at what is going to be economically viable for each state and altogether our country, because our national security is vital. If you look at China, they are developing more coal-fired power plants in the world. I think India is second. Why is that? Because they understand the importance of low-cost energy for manufacturing. I'm sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party because I stood up to them and pointed this out, how they were, being part of the Paris Climate Treaty, but at the same time, developing more coal-fired power plants. I understand that being a Kentuckian. I understand the importance of making certain that whatever we choose, that it is a best economic decision for our state. And why not for North America? We can be energy independent. Look at what Canada does as our #1 energy export. So while I'm for all the above, I'm also for what is going to keep our countries energy independent and secure from an international and a national standpoint.
So one of the reasons that the U.S. and Canada have such a close relationship is that it goes beyond simple feelings and cultural ties. It's the forged partnership and the projects we've undertaken together. So obviously we're joined at the hip on Ukraine. In many ways, we are joined at the hip in our approach to the Arctic Circle and making sure that it remains a cooperative place of research. In some respects, the work we do on each of us, the competition with China, and we've talked a little bit about immigration. Of those, which offers the potential for a rub, for hard feelings and disagreements? So work together on Ukraine and how Ukraine ends up. The Arctic investments that each side is attempting to do and the work we do there, competition with China, or immigration policy. And let me put a finer point on immigration, Haiti.
Well, I think a big chunk of the relationship aren't the bilateral issues. They're how do we work together on international challenges. That's why, during the time I served in government, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama were able to work together on things like, yes, Canada would have joined the Afghanistan Trust Fund and step up to the plate early to try to get our NATO allies to do the same. We were able to get, strong support for the military mission to protect the people of Libya. President Obama was going into an election campaign. The U.S. did all the heavy lifting before a Canadian general took over that mission. We were the only country, I think, that stepped up, other than the United States and the United Kingdom, that stepped up to doing bombing runs in both Syria and Iraq for the mission against ISIS. So, the condemnation, the coordination that we did on the invasion of Crimea, these are areas where we can make a big difference. And sometimes it's challenging for the United States to always be the first one to speak up in the room, where if Canada can have that type of relationship, I think it happened when Prime Minister Harper was there. Prime Minister Chrétien would often get calls from President Clinton before meetings and saying, listen, can you take the lead on these two issues? And that sort of spread the burden that it wasn't always the United States, putting their fist on the table and saying we need a united response to that. And I think we're better in confronting these challenges if we work together.
Gary, thoughts?
Well, I would agree. In all the conflicts that John Baird just talked about, we were always, we were joining almost at the same time. And on Libya, I got the call from the Prime Minister's office to pledge the CF-18s to go to Libya and the general, because the United States felt in the UN it would be better to have a Canadian general working with the French and some other countries in that theater of conflict, and we were very much part of that. I think we have great cooperation on the Arctic. I think going in and dealing with ISIS, we were right in real early. I think that where I think there's a little light between us a few years ago was on Iran, and I still, when you talk about things that keep you awake at night, Iran keeps me awake at night, and it's we have, the one thing I found in Washington, you're coming from Manitoba, you think it's the Middle East is Israel, Arabs, and Jews, and it's not. It's a lot of times it's the Sunni and the Shia, and it's much more complicated. And you've really picked that up in Washington, who's together and who's apart. But I worry about Iran, and I think Canada and the United States have to be. There should be no daylight between us on what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. There was a little bit previously, but I think there should be no daylight going forward. The risk is there. We all know that.
Bruce?
So I'm going to tell you where there's going to be a rub, and it's coming this fall. And I'm going to tell you, don't get yourself excited about it because of what is going to be. So we're about ready to enter full force into a presidential election again in the United States. It is deeply appealing to both parties today to do Buy America, Build America, Rah, Rah America. And every candidate on both parties is going to lean in on this subject. And it is going to be political. It's going to be hard for you all because you're going to turn on our wonderful media and you're going to hear that every day. And you're going to, what's going on? You're going to call the ambassadors, what's going on? And there's something different between politics and governing. And I'm asking you, don't get yourself all worked up, but it's going to be uncomfortable because every American politician knows that this works. And they're going to lean in on this on both parties. And it's going to be flag waving, put jobs, American workers, build at home, do all this. And so, breathe. This too shall pass.
So,
And like the ambassador Cohn pointed out, when they were all making all the hoopla on electric vehicles, he told you all to calm down. We don't have legislation yet. And sure enough, he was right. But it's hard when you're going through this. And so that's the rub that's coming.
So, Bruce, the late governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, used to say that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. This is campaigning in limericks, perhaps. But yeah, I think we could well see that come up. Kelly.
I look at Ukraine. If you look at where we were with Ukraine at the Munich Security Conference last year in 2022, I really give Canada and the U.S. and I give Ian Bremmer and Jerry Butts credit because we were all there together, and the EU, NATO, everyone was split because we knew that Russia was getting ready to invade Ukraine. We knew that so much so that Zelensky made a surprise visit to speak to us in person at the Munich Security Conference. And what did we do? We left there because of the U.S.-Canada relationship with a stronger NATO, with a stronger EU, almost convincing Germany that they needed to make certain that they wake up and think about their warmth instead of Russia and their ties to Russia with their energy industry. So I really think that changed the trajectory of the way we think about Russia. It certainly woke us all up to thinking about China and the Chinese Communist government. And now it's my hopes with President Tsai visiting from Taiwan, which is one of the first, that we are now on top of what's happening with the Communist Chinese government and their next ambition, which is Taiwan. And I think we have to give an applause to Canada, US, because if not for Ian at the Munich Security Conference and all of us being together, we wouldn't have that strong unity. We wouldn't have Finland today in NATO. We wouldn't have that strong EU. We wouldn't have NATO. We wouldn't have this relationship. So my next concern is Taiwan, and I think we all need to be focused very heavily on what is going to be coming down the road.
Our time is running short, but I wanted to ask each of you to comment on this. we're seeing a lot of talk about nearshoring, friendshoring, about sort of mini trade deals. Why is nobody talking about free trade deals? Why is nobody talking about trade deals like USMCA and expanding them? What do you think the prospects are for returning to broader trade deals?
I think it's awfully hard to get trade deals through the U.S. Congress. It's awfully hard to get fast track authority. I think we're blessed in this country to have NAFTA, to have the TPP, to have our EU trade deal, to have trade deals with all the Pacific Alliance countries in South America. And our challenge should be, rather than having more of them, perhaps should be to try to be more ambitious on the markets that we already have.
So the Brits can do it, but we can't figure out, either of us, how to do it.
Well, no, we've done it. Canada's done it. We have more access to large economies than just about any other country. And the greatest thing is there's now a political consensus in Canada. You know, you had the Liberal Party campaign viciously and hardly against the free trade agreement, and this government saved it. Chrystia Freeland did a great job on saving NAFTA. Saving the EU trade deal was a great accomplishment. So these are good things. There's a political consensus. Now we've got to go out there and try to export more to the EU, export more to Asia, export more to South America to take full advantage of that. And we're very blessed. I mean, saving NAFTA is a great accomplishment.
Gary?
Well, one of the things we should be aware of, it's the advantages of trade, free trade, and the trade agreements we have are very rarely articulated by sometimes the people that negotiated them, and sometimes by the people that are impacted in a positive way in terms of jobs. And even if there's a consumer advantage, and by the way, consumers, whether it's in Canada on dairy or United States on building a home, have very little say in trade agreements. I have to be honest about that, and they should have more say or more voice through the media to the impact of our trade agreements. But when a company goes from a second shift to a third shift based on a trade agreement, we've got to get out there and be very, very vocal about why it happened, the jobs it created. We can't just show up to cut a ribbon to start a building. You got to follow it through. And I think there are people that are opposed to trade, and there's ads. If you're in the United States, you talk about election campaign, you're going to have ads, especially in the Great Lakes states, about who is going to shaft you on a trade agreement with China and who's going to shaft you on a trade agreement with another country, and with ads out. With Chinese controlling the trade. So we have to do a much better job of articulating the advantages. I was happy we were involved in TPP, but we got in late. But we ran like hell to catch up to get into that trade agreement.
And we got in.
We got it. And I thought it was a great trade agreement. When Barack Obama negotiated that, the advantages of that were no human, prohibition against human trafficking and all state-owned enterprise rules and et cetera. But nobody went out and sold it, and Bernie Sanders did find it.
So I have a flashing light here that says your session has ended. Okay. So Bruce and Kelly, real quickly, trade
Real quick, I
prospects.
think we made a huge error not affirming TPP, especially that would have helped us so much with China. But I'm going to give you another heads up.
Okay, we've got to keep it.
Kelly,
got to keep it quick
I see
here.
Kelly gave us a heads up, and that is there is a NAFTA review that happens in the 5-year mark. And that NAFTA review has to have all 3 parties sign on. And as we sit here today, Canada is likely to be impacted by Mexico, which is not complying today, and AMLO is destroying some of the institutions that are causing it to comply. And so the risk for Canada, just sitting here doing great business with the U.S., that NAFTA could be on the rocks in just a few years.
Kelly, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs
Thumbs up
down.
because we just had this conversation and it's vitally important. So.
Okay, so Bob Zoellick, in his History of Diplomacy, says that if America gets its relationships right in the neighborhood, most other things take care of themselves. These individuals up here and so many of you have been responsible for building that alliance and building those relationships. Great, and the best is yet to come.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. David.
I'm up here with 5 very good friends of mine. I've gone through things with each one of them in different ways. And when Mark was asking them about what keeps them up at night, what wakes them up first thing in the morning, I was reminded of a conversation I had with Ambassador Hillman yesterday. And what we talked about was the fact that ambassadors, and the same thing applies to Minister Baird, they're the people who get up early in the morning, they spend all day thinking about the relationship, thinking about how maybe they can make it a little bit better. They go to sleep late at night thinking about it, and they think to themselves that, you know, if I really worked hard and I really did a good job, maybe I could make it just a little bit better for the people in our respective countries. And that all of these 5, and Ambassador Hillman and Ambassador Cohn and others, have done exactly that. And we've had a lot of conversation over the last day about the strength and the importance of the relationship between the United States and Canada, but in no small measure, it is as a result of these folks and the others, and I think we owe them a great debt of thanks.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.